underneath the castle there today that's still used. You can go on tours that are every 45 minutes. Here's a higher viewpoint.
Was it like that in George Fox's day then? Is it pretty much the same, do you think? Size-wise and so on?
I think they always add on, right? But there's a certain wall that's a circular wall, right? So that might limit what they can do inside. So this is a picture of what the courtroom looked like inside around that time. They've obviously modernized it since then. And all this is going up in North England here. So this light blue where the red arrow is going, that's Lancashire County and Duchy.
Starting with and multitudes, and then we're going to jump ahead to section 164. And multitudes of people praised God that day, for it was a joyful day. There was Justice Benson of Westmoreland, who was convinced, and Mayor Ripon, who was mayor of the town of Lancaster, who was convinced also. It was a day of everlasting salvation to hundreds of people, for the Lord Jesus Christ, the way and free teacher, was set up, and his everlasting gospel and word of life was preached over the heads of the priests, preached over the heads of the priests and such money preachers. So the sessions broke up, and several friendly people and professors spoke to the priests in their inns and the streets. The Lord that day opened abundance of mouths to speak his word of life unto them, and they fell like an old rotten house. And the cry was amongst all people far and nigh that the Quakers had got their day, and the priests were fallen. And many were made ministers of the everlasting word of life and of the gospel at that time, and they preached it freely. And Thomas Briggs was convinced that day and declared against his priest Jacques. For before that time he had discoursed with a friend concerning truth, which friend, one John Lawson, held perfection, and Thomas Briggs said unto him, Dost thou hold perfection? And he up with his hand and would have struck the friend a box in the ear. But at this day, Thomas Briggs came to be convinced and became a faithful minister of the gospel and stands to this day. Let's hear from David.
This is just a commentary on how our language has changed a little in 350 years. I'm looking at the last clause, the last sentence of that first paragraph. It says that the word of life was preached over the heads of the priests and such money preachers. We tend to think of over as a physical dimensional thing, like flying over the country. But as Fox uses it, maybe not invariably, but awful lot of the time, it's a spiritual dimension, as in prevailing over, having power over. It doesn't mean that he's shouting over their heads because he's 2 stories up and they're on the ground. The same sense in a widely quoted thing about walking cheerfully over the earth. And I find that a lot of people think that that means just a happy romp in the countryside. But over the earth means not being drawn into the affairs of the world, but prevailing over that which is not of God. I guess I also want to add a change in language, that cheerfully really should be read as courageously, not whistling a merry tune.
Thank you, David. Very useful.
And let's hear from Patricia.
I think this passage shows us what the early Friends' intent was in the work that they were doing and traveling around and ministering. It was to convert people to this new way of being that they had discovered. They weren't encouraging people to speculate on what God was, or have ideas or ideals about how to behave. They were intending that people would come into an experience that they had come into themselves. And that's why they were ministering, because they were speaking the word of life, and it was reaching to the witness of these people. And why this was a joyful day was that there was evidence that their work was not falling on deaf ears, that it was reaching to the witness of God in people and converting them into the same discovery that the Friends, such as Fox, had come into. So this is what they were working for. And as we've read many times, that it wasn't always the case that they had this joyful situation of people hearing what they were saying and finding it valid and true. So I think that this passage gives us an understanding of what they were doing and what they were hoping would happen.
So in the chat, I put a link to a short list of different 17th century words that are the same words, but used quite differently back then. It's just one page of them, so it's not exhaustive by any means. So hundreds of people returned to the truth in that day, as David pointed out in a prior session. And that's quite a lot of success. I call that, Christians would call that revival of a certain denomination anyway. And even during the trial, there was a physical healing that took place in Colonel West. And so the Spirit is really moving in people's hearts and convincing them of God's way, which in any way that it differs from man's way and man-made religion. Karen?
Is there a friend who could give an account of what Fox would have meant by perfection here?
Let's
What
hear
Fox would have meant by perfection was an inward knowledge of Christ, an experimental or experiential knowledge of that Spirit of Christ. And it's very different from what we normally feel inside. What we normally feel is our will, our history, our sense of who we are and what's around us. That's all self. But what Fox meant by perfection was this new living spirit that was so much more alive than what we normally experience. And once that Christ appears within, the self is not experienced as we normally experience ourselves, but instead there's this new life in Christ. And this new life in Christ is so much different. It has wisdom that we don't have because we're egocentric. It has wisdom, it has righteousness, which we don't have because we're affected by various things in ourselves, drives and personality and so forth. But Christ is perfect. And we can know that perfection within us. And when we know that perfection of Christ within, we are in unity with one another. Why? Because Christ is in you and Christ is in me and Christ is one. And if Christ is in you and me, then we are in unity because we both are feeling Christ within. And that's what they called the Church of Christ. It's very different from what passes for Quakerism today, which is much more of an individualistic, idea-oriented faith. And I put faith in quotation marks. But what they were talking about was a new, different spirit that is not ordinarily with us, and certainly not with us from the get-go. That's what they called the first birth, our carnal lives. What they were trying to convert people into was a second birth, or being born of the Spirit of Christ. So it was a new living way of being that, because it was a new spirit of Christ, it was perfection. And the people at that time just couldn't deal with that. They couldn't stand the fact that anybody would call themselves perfect because it meant that they would never make a mistake. But that's not what the Friends meant by it. What they meant by it was being filled with the Spirit of Christ within, and being conscious of it and being guided by it, being ruled by it, being unified by it. Very different from our first birth way of being, which is not perfect.
Thank thee.
He's welcome.
Thank you, Patricia. And let's hear from Nancy.
There's a scripture I like that goes with this explanation as well. It is Christ who works in us, both to will and to do of his good favor. It's he matures us as we walk in that life that he gives us by his Spirit.
This is very helpful. Both of thee, thank thee both.
I think everything that God does is perfect. And it's not hard for him to produce his own perfection because it's who he is and what he is. And so when the Spirit is producing the Spirit's fruit within us, it's all perfect. It's all infinite as well. And it's all of them at the same time. So the Spirit produces within us joy and love and kindness and compassion and goodness and patience. When we're striving to produce these things, say we're in religion that tells us that it's our job to produce them, we see what we produce, it's not very good. Especially patience, when we try to be patient with one another. We don't get very far with that. But God, when we stay low in the Spirit, God produces infinite patience within us and infinite kindness and his infinite goodness. And so the life of living in the Spirit or in the seed of Christ or the light is living in what God produces in us. It's not what we produce. It's a ceasing from striving and working. And religion so often tells us it's our job to produce these things, to be good and to avoid sin. When really, when we hide in him, he produces much better, infinitely better. So much so that the love that he produces within us amazes even us. And we see the goodness and the purity of what fruit he produces in us. We don't want what we produce anymore. So Paul can say, I count all that beforehand, all my working and striving. I count it all as dung. I count it all as garbage, compared to the infinite goodness of God, of Christ within us and what he produces. And so it's a life of rest instead of striving to be good in our own perception and strength.
Let's hear from Nancy.
I think I forgot to take my hand down.
No worries. Let's hear from Rita.
So although this is my first time of really laying eyes on anything that George Fox wrote, I am curious about, just what kind of writing this was. And so, you know, I don't have a lot to say about it. I'm glad to be getting that experience as to what George Fox was actually about. You know, I do like the whole idea of Quakerism that has emerged from George Fox. And so yeah, I'm happy just to observe and listen for the most part. Thanks.
Let's hear from Patricia.
I was just thinking, since it's Rita's first time listening and hearing of Fox's writings, that one approach to it might be to sort of make a mental tally of what Fox is saying that is different from the typical contemporary understanding of what Quakerism is. Because I think perhaps sometimes people come to Fox and they sort of project the Quakerism that they have known in our present day meetings onto Fox and try to make him a contemporary friend. But I think a more productive approach to his writings would be to just notice where he's different. What are the differences, and just, that I think that might be a sort of a way into his writings, is to just note when there are differences.
I'll invite any other comments on this section. And if there are no hands right away, then we'll move on to the next section. Okay, so we're going to move ahead to section 164. And we are going to divide that into two sections. So there's 164, and we're going to go down to the end of this paragraph here. You can see my highlighting. Gee,
Yep.
I wish I would have realized I could do this before. That would have been helpful. Oh well. Lynn, you're such a delightful reader. Maybe delightful isn't the right word, but I'm just wondering if you would be comfortable reading this section for us today.
I'm so thrilled that you let me read, because it's such a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn.
And I was in a fast this time, and I was not to eat until this work of God was accomplished. So the Lord's power was wonderfully set over all, and gave me dominion over all to his glory. And his gospel was freely preached that day over the heads of 40 hireling priests. I stayed 2 or 3 days in Lancaster afterwards and had some meetings. But the rude and baser sort of people plotted together to have drawn me out of the house and to have thrown me over Lancaster Bridge. But the Lord prevented them. And then they invented another stratagem. After a meeting was done in Lancaster, they brought down a distracted man in his waistcoat and another man in his waistcoat with a bunch of birchen rods bound together like besoms for them to have whipped me with. But I was moved to speak to them in the Lord's mighty power, which chained him and them, which brought him like a lamb. And I bid him throw his rods into the fire and burn them. And he did so. And I made him confess to the truth and the light of Jesus Christ. So the Lord's power came over all. So as we parted in love and peace. And when the priests had been in a rage against me at Lancaster, they had drawn up several petitions, both in Westmoreland and Lancashire, to send to the Parliament, as you may see in the book entitled Truth's Defence. And the answer to the Westmoreland petitions in Saul's errand to Damascus with his packet of letters. We got the petition and answered it and sent it to the Parliament before theirs was sent up. And the priests, when the time came, they should have sent theirs up, did not send it up because it would cost so much money.
Thank you, Lynn.
So friends wondering what a besom is, it's a broom. So it's a stick and then they tied things on the end so they can sweep with. And Fox's journal is kind of a journal of all his God encounters, or things that happen when he's ministering for God. So it's not a kind of a journal for his own personal feelings and so forth so much and thoughts, but the adventures he has with God as he is sent out to preach the good news. And you'll note in this passage similarities to the book of Acts. And that's why he called it Saul's errand to Damascus, because Saul had letters from the priests to accuse Christians of various things and persecute them. And so he's feeling quite persecuted by the priests in this section of the journal. And some of the charges that are brought up against him again are some of them are the same ones that he just cleared himself in his trial for blasphemy. And so we see the trickery of the priests in that they're making up false accusations against him, one, but they're using the same accusations that he's already cleared himself in court over again to try and impress a new bunch of people to be against Fox and the Quakers. David?
Well, another linguistic comment. They use the word distracted, a couple of distracted men. And when we use that word, it sort of means that your attention drifts from one thing to another. I think that at that time it meant a person who was mentally ill. I find the same word used in Fox's famous letter to Lady Claypole, and she was a person who was of distracted mind. And I think that the mob is just trying to get some folks who don't have good judgment and are going to do whatever other people send them to do. And it's powerful here is that the Lord's mighty power got through to them rather than the thuggery assignment that they were sent out on. It's just beautiful how this ends, that they parted in love and peace. and they burned up the things that they were instructed to go beat him up with.
Are there any further comments on this section, or shall we move along? Let's hear from Patricia.
Just a short comment. There are two petitions that are drawn up here, one from the priests called Truth's Defense, and the other from the Friends called Saul's Errand to Damascus with his packet of letters. And it just reminded me that how prolific the early Friends were and how determined they were to answer every charge that was presented against the faith that they had through writing. If wherever there was an accusing or incorrect misrepresentation of their faith, they would then publish a booklet or a pamphlet that would not only present their position correctly, but would also attack the position of the ones that had misrepresented them. So they were very thorough in answering any accusations made against them.
Patricia, my first reaction when I hear that is imagining that there might be some challenge in being able to accurately describe or refute these accusations. Today, we seem to have so much problem agreeing to how things should be worded. Do you have a sense for whether that was a challenge for the Friends at that time?
No, I don't think it was a great challenge to them, because they had the same experience, the same perspective as I had been saying to Karen previously. They were in unity. When they read the scriptures, they understood them in the same way, and it wasn't conformity as today we might think conforming is the only way to get unity, and might even pride ourselves on the fact that we're not unified, that it would indicate some individual thought. But what they were about was not individual thought. What they were about was spirit, the spirit of Christ, which was one. And so, as I was saying earlier, when they came into that same spirit, their understanding was in unity, one with another, because it was the same spirit informing them of what was real and what was true. So there was unity. And as such, they could present the same message. You know, I'm sure there were times when people were attributing to themselves Christ's spirit, but there was a large enough body of people who knew what that was and were grounded in it, that they could address that kind of error. So the unity among them generally wasn't a problem. It was, as you can see here, their problem was the status quo, the kind of corruption of religion that they saw all around them. And that's what they were together trying to rectify. Did that answer you, Donna?
Yes, that was very helpful, Patricia. Thank you.
And if someone's interested in seeing what those differences were and what the Quaker position was in contrast and spelled out, reading Saul's Errand to Damascus, and I put a link in the chat for anyone who wants to, would be a good source of teaching on that and be very succinct in doing so. Nancy?
I can understand from my own experience that when that the Lord, the Holy Spirit does give the right words and the understanding and wisdom. It flows into your minds to write what needs to be written or what needs to be heard. So it wouldn't have been difficult in that way either. Even though it can and does at times and did cause stir up anger among the people that could not hear the voice of God and had more interest in their own popularity.
Thank thee, Nancy. And let's hear from Rita.
Thank you. I think, just keeping in mind, putting it into context from what George Fox was saying, I find for my own learning, I always like the storytelling aspect of it and how it relates to real life. And, you know, when I think about real life and I, you know, the light or the Lord or whatever I choose to call God, and I find, you know, I find that topical way. Well, how does God work in my life? What do I see? Like, you know, because these people back in the 1600s were, you know, they were experiencing a certain thing, either individually, they were given gifts, and they were given gifts as a group. And, you know, I like to think too of, you know, how that relates to the topicality of the day. And I think of, you know, my background is very much of marketing, outreach, stuff like that. And I think of all the doors that God opens for me, things that I wouldn't have thought possible. And, you know, when those things happen, I know that they are of God. And so, you know, that topical part of it, I like to hear little snippets of little stories as well. I just learn better that way. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
It's very easy in our humanity to get very ego attached to things, to ideas, to our religion and our politics. But the spirit does not work that way. The ego is opposed to the spirit, and the spirit is opposed to the ego. So the spirit produces something very different in us. And we kind of know the truth deep in our spirit. It's not just an opinion or a theory or a doctrine that we're taught from external, but God speaks his truths within us. And it's a very different way of living, isn't it? It's not what we can figure out. It's a way of living from the revelation of God. And it's a very deep knowing. And it's a very solid thing that's not fragile or precarious. But if you're used to just religion and not the spirit, then your position is very fragile and may not align with the truth, capital T truth, that God is and what God is saying. And so people are thrown into a rage. And envy is another fruit that Fox is continuously talking about, that is in the priests, because they do not have what God is producing within the friends. They could have it. They could choose, but it requires a surrender to the truth of God and his wisdom and his governance, instead of our wisdom and our self-governance. They really are opposite ways of living. To the new folks that come, Colonel West was feeling very weak and physically weak for a long time, but during the trial of George Fox for blasphemy, he was actually physically healed. And so he's in this section here.
Thank you, Chad. I put up the next part of 164. It feels like we're ready to move on to that. Is that okay with everyone? And Ginny, I wonder if you would read this section.
Certainly.
Thank you.
And when the priests saw that they were overthrown at the sessions at Lancaster, as aforesaid, some of the priests and envious justices informed the Judge Wyndham against me, and in the open court, the judge made a speech against me at Lancaster Assizes. Colonel West, being clerk of the Assizes, the judge commanded him to grant out a warrant for me, and he spoke to the judge boldly of my innocency. The judge commanded him again either to write a warrant or go off his seat. And he told the judge plainly he would not do it. He should do it himself if he would. And he would offer up all his estate and his body for me. So he stopped the judge, which was of great service, and came over the country, and the Lord's power came over all, and stopped the envy both in priests and justices.
Thank you, Ginny. Let's hear from David.
Well, it's not very often that we see a person defying a judge, speaking back, not doing what the judge has said, and not thereby immediately being thrown into jail for contempt. Now, it could be because Colonel West had some social standing and some mutual respect between them. And the fact that he said, I would give up everything I have for this preacher, but it is quite remarkable. And it ends, I don't see it now, but I think that the last sentence is how so many of these stories end. I believe Lewis Benson says that this is the most frequently used phrase in all of Fox's writing, that the power of the Lord was over all. And he never claims it out of his own brilliance or force of personality, but all the credit given to our divine sustainer. Still, it's very dramatic.
Let's hear from Patricia.
Yeah, just something short on the word envy. It appears very often in what we've been reading for the past couple sessions, I guess. And I don't think it means the same thing that we mean by the word today. I think today we mean to see something in another that we desire to have for ourselves but don't, and as a result try to take it away or diminish the person who has this thing that we want ourselves. But I don't think that is what it means in this writing. I don't think that the people want what Fox has, but I do think that they just want to diminish or destroy him because of the conflict that he's causing, both within them and within their society. So yeah, it just doesn't seem like the word could mean exactly what we mean by it today. In both their time and ours, it probably means wanting to destroy another, but I don't think then that it had the meaning that it has today of desiring to have what someone else has.
Thank you, Patricia, and let's hear from Ginny.
I'm struck in this passage and in others of how people convinced were willing to sacrifice, how it changed their lives, and how Colonel West's action influenced other people, that he was willing to give up his estate and his body. And that moved everybody. We see that in other places too, and I just find it so moving.
Some background from Colonel West's Wikipedia page. Obviously, he's a colonel in the Parliament's army. He is also a member of Parliament, at least 3 different parliaments. And he's a friend of Judge Bell, who was the Chancellor of the Duchy at that time. So he's a man of quite a bit of influence. I'm not sure how much estate he had, but it does speak that he had a lot to lose as far as his body, his estate, his position in the army of influence. And Patricia?
Responding to what Jenny had brought up, I think that it just shows how important this was, what a difference it made in their lives to come into this knowledge of Christ. That there's a verse in scripture, what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his soul? And so they had felt a stirring of life in their soul that was different from anything that they had known before. And they realized that all the accumulated wealth and possessions and status that they had could not evoke this same power and life that they had been given spiritually. And so they were willing to sacrifice everything in order to stay in contact with this life within. So, there have been martyrs. There were martyrs in the primitive times of Christians. And it's in a way, it's not, it seems like great loss to us to have, your estate or your life taken. But they understood that the life that they were given spiritually made all these other treasures to be trifles. That's how different it was for them. You think today about how many self-help books there are and how many people go to therapists and how many people have disorders in their lives. And what would they give if they could be healthy and happy? They give everything for that. Well, this was the answer that they were given, and it worked, and it was real. So they knew what it was worth. It was worth more than anything they could acquire, materially or socially. And it's something that we can't really even imagine until it becomes a reality within us. And then we can understand what the scriptures are about. This great archaic tome that we have that is about humanity's calling to a better place, a better way. And here was in the early Friends springing up an understanding that had been lost for 1600 years. So it can be lost, and it has been lost again. But it's there for us because it's in each human being has within him or her the recognition of this call to truth. And it's really the answer to so many of our disturbances socially and psychologically. So it's worth reading and reminding ourselves of what's possible.
Thank you, Patricia. And let's hear from David.
Well, I'm glad that Patricia has pointed out the incongruity of this word envy, because it comes across quite different from how we usually use it. So I just did a quick online search, and in the contemporary usage, it's a feeling of discontent or covetousness with regard to another's advantages, success, possessions, etc. And then it says an obsolete usage is ill will. So that's what the priests and professors had, was ill will toward Fox. It also said that it goes back to the Latin invidere, to look upon. So you can look upon someone or something else with all kinds of different feelings. And in this case, it's one of ill will, wishing the worst on George Fox, not wanting his leather breeches or something.
Are we ready to move on to 165? Fairly short section. Is there someone who would read this for us?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, Steve.
The same night, I came into Lancaster at the assizes and heard of a warrant that was to granted out for me. I judged it better to proffer myself than for them to seek me. I went to Judge Fell's and Colonel West's chambers. And as soon as I came in, they smiled at me, and Colonel West said, "What? Was I come into the Dragon's Mouth?" So I walked up and down the town, and no one questioned me nor meddled with me, and I stayed there until the judge went out of town. And thus the Lord's blessed power that is over all carried me over all and gave me dominion over all in his glorious work and service for his great name's sake. And this persecuting John Sawyer at last was drowned, and the vengeance of God overtook the other justice, Thompson, that he was struck with the dead palsy upon the bench and carried away off his seat and died.
Thank you, Steve. I'm wondering if there are any comments on this this section 165, and whether we should move on to 166, which is a bit of a longer section, might take us over 3 o'clock. Patricia?
Yeah, I think that last paragraph draws attention to itself. And when I read that, I thought immediately of that passage in Acts where a couple, I think their names were Ananias and Sapphira, had joined with the newly formed Christian group, and part of the behavior was to give over your wealth to the community. And this couple kept back some of their wealth or land or something. And they were trying to hide it from others so that others would know that they hadn't given all their wealth to the community. And I believe it was Peter confronts them one by one, and each of them dies on the spot because they have lied and tried to hold on to their wealth when they were hypocritically doing that. And so it's a little, when I read this and also that passage in Acts, it's a little abrasive to read this because it's sort of, and I was thinking, well, why is it abrasive, and why wasn't this kind of relation of these stories abrasive to Fox or to the early apostles? How could they have made these statements? They seem so to have the attitude that is so much against our contemporary way of thinking. We've been so trained to not claim that we have God on our side, that anybody who claims they have God on their side is isn't a very thoughtful or profound person. That's what we especially, I think, since World War II, we've had that attitude. And it's a way to dampen our certainty about things, because we've realized that wars can be so dangerous. And so one of the ways to reduce conflict is to reduce the certainty that we have that God's on our side. And the apostles and the early friends did not have that that reticence. And so they could make statements like this that seem almost like bad manners to us. But I think what I'm coming to the conclusion of is that this is some social training that we've had to prevent conflict between different groups or different parties, is that you can't claim that God's on your side because you don't know. And the underlying belief in that is that nobody can know God. So how dare you say that God's on your side, or how dare you act that way? And that's just part of our contemporary mindset, I think, at least among liberal, educated people. So I guess what I'm saying is this paragraph just brought up the differences in the social, the dominant social understanding of that age and this age. Because another thing is that God would not do anything that was unloving, like strike somebody down because of their behavior. No, Fox didn't feel that kind of restraint.
Thank you, Patricia. And let's hear from David.
Well, here's my reflection on it, both psychologically and theologically. I think that most everyone on earth wants to see injustice stopped and justice prevail. Justice doesn't necessarily mean retribution, but at least righting the balance, pointing out that some things are evil and should be stopped. And especially those, it may be harder for some of us here to understand this, but people who have been historically and systemically and unrelentingly oppressed really want God to do something about it because they can't. And those who are entrusted with law and order, are often on the side of injustice. Law and justice are not equated. The theological part of it is that I'm sure that early friends would have remembered, and maybe it's in the writing, the teaching that, quote, justice is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. In other words, it's not up to us to go out and slay or deactivate or whatever the bad guys. Doesn't mean you can't stand up against some things, but in terms of taking them off the scene like this, it is, I think, an advance in ethics to say, God will take care of this. It's not for me to go out there and strike them dead. And I'm speaking only for myself. I know that I have impulses of wanting to do drastic things to keep the bad guys from doing more bad. But particularly in light of Jesus's teachings and example, the way of retribution is not the way. And we are called to show love and avail ourselves of the gifts of the Spirit, which we can't really will into being, of love and forbearance and forgiveness. These are gifts. These are gifts that we can open ourselves to. But there are some understandable, and I would even say justifiable, human dynamics of emotion and wanting to be liberated. I find that through a history of several hundred years of hymnology and spirituals in the Black American community. Let's go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. So there is that sense of reliance on God's power. But it also does not take a neutral stand between oppression and liberation. So I'm not surprised when Fox is relieved that these people who've been oppressing him have been taken off the scene. It is shocking to read that. It goes against particularly the middle class virtue of being nice rather than abrasive. It's pretty stark.
Thank you, David. And I'm going to stop the screen share and then invite Karen and then Nancy to speak. So over to you, Karen.
When I first read the account in Acts, I took it literally, but then later I read that the Friends often, and I guess Roman Catholics too, and some other denominations, take stories like this sometimes spiritually and metaphorically. And my understanding of the couple in Acts was that they experienced a spiritual death. And since Fox, of course, was familiar with this story in the scriptures, I think it's possible that although these people did experience a physical death, that what he was talking about was a spiritual death. So this is how it comes to me. But I found the other accounts interesting as well.
Excuse me, just a minute, Karen. Are you saying that you're seeing the drowning of John Sorry and Justice Thompson struck dead with palsy as being spiritual reference rather
Yes,
than physical?
yeah. I mean, I don't doubt that they died physically, and I don't doubt that the people in Acts died physically, but I think that the significance of the story is their spiritual deaths because of what they held back from Christ and God and their opposition. And that's what we're to take from it, and not to take it necessarily so literally.
Let's hear from Nancy.
What I'm aware of too, though, is that even when the evil that people do is from the flow of another spirit, not Christ, as well as their own choices to follow that path of evil. And this other spirit can use other people to do the same things and does. But and we know that, but still the Lord, as Fox said, is over all, and he makes a way where there seems to be no way.
For me, I think there's a big difference between man-made certainty and God-given certainty. Man-made thinking that God is on our side or we're on God's side, And God affirmed, spiritually revealed truths that we are pursuing God's way. And there's a clarity that God gives, an insight that is very deep. And so if we're not seeing from God's given gift of sight and discernment, then we have no right to judge what's in man's hearts, because we can't see that, but God does. And when he does give us discernment as to what's in God's heart, or a man's heart, we can feel vindicated when he takes vengeance. I note that Fox never takes vengeance himself. Even when Judge Fell says, okay, tell me what happened so I can bring the law against these people that are persecuting you, I'm on the island, Fox refuses and says they can do nothing else, and they just exhibited the spirit of their priests and of their religion, so they can do no else. But he does seem to glorify when God takes vengeance and vindicates him. And obviously we can't see, we're not in that time period, so we don't see all the things that these judges were doing to oppress people. But maybe Fox does and had a clear insight. So he could rejoice in their being removed so that they could do no more oppression or tyranny or evil in the land. And it seems that when we are confronted with light and we choose against light, human beings get worse. They go further into the darkness. It's a choice to be even more evil and do more evil things. It is a kingdom warfare between light and dark. And that's not always obvious to us. But when God sends us on mission, when we're moving in the light, we see the opposition of the darkness more. And it's very clear. And our discernment is deepened, not just natural discernment, but God-given supernatural discernment into things. And we see the power of evil moving through people. Whereas if we're not necessarily moving in the light or on mission from God to do this warfare between kingdoms, and it's not a warfare of physical armaments and weapons, then we don't normally see these things. We're not very attuned to it. But the more we move in the light, the more we see the dark rises up. And hopefully when the dark rises up, we stay attuned to the light that lifts us over that ocean of darkness that is out there and within us sometimes. And that the infinite ocean of light lifts us over all opposition. But even when we do so, even when we work, even when God calls us to do something, we stay low in the spirit. We stay in what the spirit produces within us. We don't go like Moses and kill the Egyptian to try and free the Israelites. That's our plan and our wisdom and our governance. And it wasn't the way of God. And so when we move in that infinite spirit, the infinite spirit produces its fruit instead of our fruit that we could do with our own wisdom